Hey guys, so if everything has gone to plan, I should now be live for 7 seconds already. If you can hear me, please say aloha. That seems to have become the tradition on this channel. Um, I also want to point out that I am like 1 minute early, and I'm never early for anything in my life, but I'm early for you guys. So thanks for tuning in and joining me this evening. Obviously, this is slightly later timing. Um, Yay! Hi Harry, how you doing? So we've got loads of people here. I think we've got at least about 100 people online at the moment. Great. Can you hear me okay? Am I clear? Am I loud? Am I too loud? I have now learned a little bit more of this software, so I know how to turn the volume settings up and down. Great that you can all hear me. Let me know if I'm too loud or too quiet. I can adjust the settings slightly. So we've got Harry in southern England, Nalu in Spain, Daniel in Sweden, Corey in Sydney, Australia, Professor Dark in Germany. Are you actually a professor? I want to know that. Jordan in California. Oh, I wish I was in California right now. I can't complain actually. We've got awesome weather here at the moment. We're having by English standards, a heat wave. I also, just because this came up on Facebook today, I want to tell people, so London and England in general has a reputation of having such terrible weather, but did you know that Paris has a higher annual rainfall than London does? That's right, Paris in France is wetter than London is. Anyway, so I did mention, obviously you're free to ask whatever questions you like. Oh, hi, in Toulouse, Antonin, Brazil. Wow, cool. I've been to Brazil a couple of times. I'd love to go back one day. Dorset. I love Dorset. So Lyme Regis is one of my favourite places to go to and bash rocks and find fossils. Atlanta, Georgia. Brazil again. Buenos Aires. Awesome. Argentina. South Africa. Vancouver. This is awesome. We've got 200 people now online. Norwich. Hello, Norwich. I was there couple of years ago. Wow, we've got people from all over. Connecticut, Arizona. I like Arizona a lot. I've been to Phoenix and Tucson, Switzerland, Manitoba, so Canada, Chile. Awesome. Wow, really. So we've got like all over the world here. Italy. That's brilliant. Oklahoma. Nice. Brilliant. So Texas, hey Texas, Ireland, good to see you all. Thank you for joining. Right, so I did mention West Sussex. That's just up the road from me, so you're not far away at all. I did mention that it'd be nice to talk about movie weapons, or movie and TV weapons. So I can probably stay on for about an hour tonight, and then I really need to get some sleep. So I'm actually quite busy with work at the moment. I know it's work. I'm very lucky to be able to be doing stuff like this as work, but nevertheless, it's still real work at my end. No Lucy, Rob. No, she might pop in. She's actually feeding a baby at the moment. But yeah. Anyway, I decided to have a later live stream than normal as an experiment because I think probably more people who watch this channel can log on at this kind of time. Matthew says hi from Brittany. So people should know, a lot of people don't know this, Great Britain is only called Great Britain because of Brittany in France. So we're the big Britain and they're the little Britain. So it's something that really, really irks me in the media when people, yeah, let's make Britain great again. No, that's not why Britain is called great. It's not because of the British Empire or anything like that. It's purely from the French Grande Bretagne. It means big Britain, Brittany, rather than small Brittany. Anyway, end of rant. Hi from Germany, yes. 667 Gullin. Right, so, yes, including firearms. Yes, Dat Boy, including firearms. Why not? Firearms in fantasy and sci-fi and movies and stuff. Why not? So the messages are coming fast and furious here. So, Wing 083. This is the first time you caught my live stream. Well, I'm very glad you're joining us. So I think we're up to about 300 people now. That's brilliant. Hello from Bayswater. Wow, that's just like up the road from where I used to live, pretty much. So that's in central, slightly west of central London, for anyone who doesn't know. Right, so hi Scott, how you doing? So let's start with the questions. So have you got any good questions or just points you want to make actually about movie and TV swords? The reason, obviously I did a video about this recently, and lots of people compared it to videos that Shadiversity does, understandably, because he's known particularly for the fantasy weapons kind of genre, which is more his wheelhouse than mine. That being said, I'm a bit older than Shad, so technically I've probably been doing things like role-playing games and wargaming and stuff for longer than he has. But he's very much more embedded in that stuff. Obviously, I'm more in the history direction, and he loves the fantasy stuff. But it is a very, very interesting mental exercise when you think about inventing a whole different world or environment, and then you start talking about the weapons in it. And it's something... So I used to be a bit of a kind of authenticity. I don't want to use that word, the N word, but I used to be kind of like a very strict about authenticity of weapons and going, oh, that fantasy sword looks ridiculous. It looks too over the top. It looks too big. But no, actually, the fact is that if it's a different world and you're fighting different creatures and you've got different sort of physiology and everything, you're going to have different weapons, quite simply. I mean, look how different daggers and knives can be for their different purposes. Compare like a rondel dagger to a bowie knife. They're completely different things because they're for completely different purposes in different places at different times. But that being said, you do get knives like bowie knives in medieval Europe, and later on you do get things like rondel daggers, I suppose, stiletto type things in trench fighting daggers. So it's a very interesting mental exercise, I think, to look at what weapons might have evolved in or have been preferred in a certain environment. Right, I'm now going to have a look down the questions and see what we've got going on. We don't have any super chats yet, so that makes life easy for me on that front. Obviously super chats welcome, but I will look down the big list I've got here. So lots of hello Tanith in Essex. It's nice to know where everyone's tuning in from. I'm a big fan of Essex actually. I go over, I've got some antique buying friends over that way, so I actually drive over that direction not infrequently. Thank you for all the nice messages, by the way. So Scott McGregor says, he says, movie weapons. I rewatched Willow recently, and it was surprisingly good for a movie of its era. And, you know, I recently did it was a sponsored video for Raid, but I did, looking at kind of some of the best fantasy movies for weapons, and I list Willow in there because, like I pointed out, and like you're saying, it's got Indian pata or Dan pata. It's got pretty good long swords and arming swords. It's got some more fantasy stuff. It's got a Zweihander, pretty more or less historically accurate Zweihander in there. It's got some of the armor is terrible, it has to be said, but some of the armor is historically inspired. So yes, I agree. Willow is underrated film. So Tantaclaws 6 says, recently watched House of Flying Daggers, which I haven't seen. I've seen trailers for it, which is essentially, wushu kind of weapons aren't the most realistic, obviously very flexible blades, and but they're great from the point of view of being artistic pieces. Yeah, I agree. And I'm a big fan of Kung Fu films. Many of you will know I used to do Kung Fu before I did HEMA. And in fact, when I discovered HEMA, I was at the time studying Hung Gar Kung Fu. I never actually did weapons in Kung Fu. I just did unarmed stuff. I didn't do it for long enough to get to the weapons. But yeah, I'm a big fan of Kung Fu movies, and it's interesting to see the Chinese movie industry has actually brought in more historically correct Chinese weapons as time's gone by. So obviously I don't know the ins and outs of the Chinese movie industry, but I would imagine that there's been a similar impetus. And when we look at companies like LK Chen making more historically accurate swords of the Warring States period, I suspect there's been a momentum in China for more historically accurate stuff, just as there has been in the West as well. So Matthew says, without any hard feelings, thanks William the Conqueror. Okay. Um, uh, okay, so Mr. Doctor Boomstick says the gun from The Fifth Element is great. Yeah, if I remember correctly, they've got a mixture of kind of completely made up sci-fi guns, haven't they, with grenade launchers and stuff. But they've also got some real firearms with like body kits on them, if I remember correctly. But The Fifth Element's a great film. I like most things by Luc Besson. In fairness, I really love the visual style of it. Um, so Chip Ford says that one of he or she's favourite moments on the channel was my takedown of the god awful sword of Gryffindor prop. So I hate that sword so much. It's such a missed opportunity because you think about, J.K. Rowling gave us a certain amount of history to Hogwarts, and we know when Godric Gryffindor is essentially around in the late Anglo-Saxon period. So it would have been so easy and such so cool, I think, to put something like, I don't know, like the Sutton Hoo sword or replica of it in there, but something properly of the period. But no, the sword of Gryffindor, it's in the style, literally, it's a copy of an 18th century pillow sword, they were called. In other words, it's a home defence sword, but it's like a kind of a very dainty spadroon, I suppose. But yeah, it's just awful, especially for something that's supposed to be Anglo-Saxon era. And Chip says, why do you think the filmmakers shied away from a more migration era? I mean, just because they don't care, I guess. And also, you've got to bear in mind that Daniel Radcliffe, as a 11-year-old, 12-year-old kid, had to wield this sword. So I guess they just wanted something that was nice and easy and light for a kid to wave around. And they just don't care. That's the ultimate thing. So, many of you will have seen Todd of Todd Stuff, and Todd Cutler do his video on basically criticizing people like me. It's fine. Todd and I are mates, but basically saying, you shouldn't necessarily criticize movie and TV swords in this way because this is the reasons that they make them like that. And of course, we know that. I agree with Todd. Yeah, okay. But I have a HEMA channel, okay? I have a channel talking about antique swords and antique weapons and this. So what am I going to do? Of course I'm going to criticize the things which you can criticize. I accept, like I say, we know that Harry Potter swords are not going to be historically correct most of the time because they don't care about it. That's fine. Right. Didier Nicole says, do you think the baby is better learning rattle and shield or dual wielding rattles? At the moment, I tell you, he's pretty good at grappling. So he's quite little Alfred, my little boy, is 7 months old, and he's quite good fun. He's quite rough and tumble. So I suspect he'll end up being a wrestler, unlike me. We got Czech Republic. Hi, Jack in Czech Republic. I've never known how to say Brno in Czech Republic, but I've never actually been to Czech Republic, and somewhere I really, really want to go. I have to see Prague, obviously, one day before I die. Sparrow, you're very welcome. Thank you for thanking me. Oh, Saksham from India. So, brilliant! It's the third time you've caught my live stream. It's 2:20 a.m. in India right now. Well. Again, India, a place that I really desperately want to visit one day. And in fact, Lucy and I were talking about that yesterday. So, India's like near the top of my want to visit, want to travel around one day list. So Christopher Rowley has asked, is the short sword in Shad's book good or bad? I'm afraid I don't know. I've seen Shad's videos talking about his book, but I haven't read the book and I've only seen the cover in his videos, so I can't comment on that. But is it the one with the sort of rapier? Maybe I do know. Is it got kind of like a glowing blade and it looks like a kind of fancy version of rapier hilt? I actually thought that looked pretty cool, actually. Yeah, so if that's the sword you're talking about, I think it's pretty good. But Shad knows what he's talking about in that regard. He wouldn't tolerate something that was complete rubbish, I think. So I can't say your name because it's a bunch of letters that don't go. So TRSH BRNR1, says combat evaluation of the beginning of the Germans versus as Amazons battle in Wonder Woman. I actually really love that. So I think Wonder Woman is quite a good film, and I like lots of things about it. However, I have to say, one of the things that really bugged me about that film is you very rarely see the people using their bayonets. And very often they've got a bayonet fixed, or they don't have a bayonet fixed. They're charging, but they don't have a bayonet fixed, which just I don't think anyone in World War One would have done unless they had a submachine gun near the later part of the war. But even when they do have bayonets fixed, there's only a few instances of them actually using them. And I guess that was for safety reasons. The choreographer didn't feel safe with it. So I like it. It's good fun. Obviously, it's got the swinging off the cliffs and all this kind of stuff. But it's not... It's kind of inspiring, but it's not necessarily kind of realistic in any kind of way. But maybe that's something I should do. Maybe I should do an actual video of that one. So I'm just reading down the comments, finding another. P squared 1234 says, how heavy can a polearm get before it becomes unusable by mere mortals? It depends on the mortal, I guess. Are you talking about Hafthor Bjornsson? I'm imagining somewhere in the region of, I mean, I'll have to use imperial measurements here. A pole weapon, if we're talking about something like a poleaxe or a halberd, which is probably one of the heaviest types of polearm, maybe about 15 pounds in weight. So that's about the top end weight for things like Zweihanders. Sorry, I'm going to have to clear my throat for a second. Please excuse me. Right, that's better. So Zuprax says, we'd love to hear more about the special weapons for humans to use against goblins. Well, you know, goblins are kind of similar size and physical robustness, I would say, to humans, aren't they, in most fantasy? So probably, for the most part, the same kind of weapons that people use against humans. But goblins might be very, very numerous. So, for example, rather than having a pike block, if you're going to be swarmed by lots of goblins, you might want cutting weapons. The general rule is against multiple opponents, you want to have things that can cut because you want to keep moving. So you might be looking at things more like two-handed swords, glaives, this kind of stuff, I would say. Yeah, there we go. There's an idea. Oh, right, okay. So Mr. Dr. Boomstick says his Sephiroth sword vid was good. I presume you're talking about Shad. I don't know that video, I'm afraid. Oded says, hello from Israel. Hi in Israel, how you doing? So Andy J, very good question. Do you think a Klingon bat'leth meets the definition of a sword? That's a really good question. Does it meet the definition of a sword? Yes, I guess it does. And the reason I would back that up is because there are certain types of half-swording swords which in use are very, very similar in the sense that where you hold them and what you can do with them. So, yes, I would say that they do meet the definition of a sword, but you could also argue that they're quite similar to a polearm as well. Right, let's see. Daniel Taylor, question. Which Excalibur of all that you've seen is the best looking? I've always got to say, I'm just thinking, is this true? Yes. I've got to say the movie Excalibur, with Nigel Terry, the who's the director of that? It's John Borman. Yeah. So I've actually held that one, and it was a good replica sword. It was light, nicely balanced. It was like it wasn't exactly like any historical longswords I've ever actually seen, but it looked like it could be. It was plausible, and it was a well-made sword. So without a shadow of a doubt, Excalibur, I would say. Excalibur in Excalibur, the 1980, is it film? 81, that kind of date. Um, so Ryan Newman says the £15 of the biggest Zweihander is located in a different place than the £15 halberd. That's 100% true. I agree. However, if you look at the heaviest polearms, which are pretty much pole axes and types of halberd and certain types of glaive, they tend to be, I think, in the weight range of about 10 or 12 pounds. So the question, not criticising you, Ryan, I agree with you, but the question was, what is the heaviest plausible polearm that someone could wield? And I think £15 is kind of like the top end of what's plausible. I don't think anything above that would be plausible, but if someone told me that there is somewhere in a museum there is a poleaxe that weighs, or a halberd that weighs £13, I could believe that is possible, if that makes sense. I just saw a really good question then. There we go. So Sportsboy5570 says, Matt, will you ever do a video on the military orders, i.e. Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, etc., and their weaponry, and have you ever visited the fortifications on Malta? So number one, yes, I have visited the fortifications on Malta. In fact, we want to go back to Malta probably next year. I love Malta. It's an amazing place, and I encourage anyone to go and visit there. I actually don't know a huge amount about the knightly orders. Now, I would like to do some videos about them one day, but they're not the sort of videos I can churn the information out of my head and just do it. That is the period of medieval history that I'm particularly weak on. So as you probably know from the content of my videos, I have always specialised more in up until 1066, more or less, and a little bit after, and then the kind of First Crusade period, and then from about the middle of the 13th century through to the end of the 15th century. So that, unfortunately, they kind of fall right in that hole in the period which I'm weakest on. So basically, I'd need to do proper research videos on that, because I don't want to make BS. I want to make sure that what I'm saying is, first of all, true, and secondly, is actually of interest and useful to anyone. So they have to be research videos. But yeah, I'd like to do that at some point, and that's a good idea for videos. Thanks. That's a good. So John Washburn says, what were those spike or dagger weapons that were used in Excalibur? Well, they were an artistic rendering, so they weren't particularly historically accurate, but they were a version of what we would sometimes call the Allspice. I'm not very good at pronouncing it. That's the German name of it. That would translate into English as an all spike. All really means spike, so saying all spike, I believe, is like saying spike. But anyway, there you go. There is a French name for them. My friend Fabrice Cognot, the researcher and weapon maker, blacksmith, he would be able to tell you what the French name was for them. And I know that he's made a replica of one of the French ones. But they are shown in manuscripts, and they are shown in one treatise. I believe it's one of the Paulus Cal manuscripts, or Das Solothurn, maybe. But they are shown being used in a kind of knightly combat. I won't call it judicial combat, because I'm not 100% sure it is a judicial combat in that case, although in Excalibur it was. But anyway, in knightly combat, and yeah, they're basically specialised armoured fighting weapons, and it's kind of like half sword, but better than half sword. So it's kind of, it's got some of the advantages of a short spear, and some of the advantages of half sword, and very rigid, like a poleaxe spike as well. So, so Donacha Magiva, sorry if I've mispronounced your name there, but I guess that's an Irish name. Who would win in a fight, naked Matt Easton with Braveheart's sword versus naked Matt Easton with Aragorn's sword? Well, why not try it? We can, the science is available these days. So I'd personally prefer in a fight probably to use Braveheart's sword, actually. I happen to know Braveheart's sword was made by Deltin, and they're pretty good swords. Now, Oregon's sword, of course, was made by Peter Lyon down in New Zealand. They're both good swords, actually. They're both actually quite good functional swords. But honestly, Braveheart's sword, whilst it's completely historically completely wrong for the late 13th century for William Wallace, it's actually not wrong for, let's say, a kind of mid 15th century large longsword. And fundamentally, I don't really like the design of Aragon's sword because of the massive pommel. Now, that pommel would have to be hollow for it to make a lot of sense. But at the end of the day, it is a longsword, and longsword versus two-handed sword, I kind of think the bigger the sword, the more advantage it's got. So frankly, I think a two-handed sword, as a Zweihander, has an advantage over a longsword if it's the same person with the same skills and everything else being equal, assuming it's in an open space with enough space to move around. So there you go, there's your answer, without me even needing to take my clothes off. I'm just going to go and have a look at the super chats because I've got a bunch of them sitting here now. Right. So Japan at War, thank you very much for joining the live stream. I'm glad you enjoy the channel. Thank you. Jean, I don't know what. So it could be Jean or it could be Jean. It depends whether you're French or American. But Jean Thrun says a lot said about the weight of hammers and axes in terms of weight, but at what point is a weapon too wide in terms of length at its head to be practical? Robert's hammer in the books inspired the question. It's about 13 inches wide. Is that Robert Baratheon? So is this Game of Thrones, I think? That's an interesting point. I've never really thought about it. So in the real world, obviously, hammer or axe heads or polearm heads, there is only a certain size they can get to before they become too heavy to use. You could make them incredibly thin, but then they'd be too fragile to use. I mean, you could use them, but they'd bend or break pretty easily. So there is a kind of optimum size that kind of, it's about that big, isn't it? Basically, so axes like Dane axes or halberds or certain types of long spiked warhammers, they never really get much bigger than about that, which I suppose at its maximum is maybe 13 inches wide. But a warhammer that was that wide would be quite thin, so it'd have quite a long, slender spike, like the 16th and 17th century horsemen's hammers you see. So you'd have quite a long, narrow spike of about that long, and then quite a narrow hammerhead as well. So it's really more about weight. There is a question about rotational inertia here as well, and the wider something gets, and this is true of crossguards on things like Zweihanders, if you get something with a very long crossguard, any medieval sword, well, after the Viking era, any medieval sword which has a crossguard, but some of them have very long ones, particularly the bigger the sword gets, big Zweihanders tend to get long crossguards. When you rotate them around their axis, you can feel the rotational inertia of the crossguard, and this actually assists in edge alignment during cutting. So I've always tried to emphasize in videos that actually having a long crossguard can be beneficial in cutting because it helps you ensure that the edge is pointing in the right direction. Now, conversely, you can get the same effect or similar effect with a curved blade. So curved swords, because they're curved and create rotational inertia around an axis, that can help with edge alignment as well. So it has the same result, but in a completely different way. But therefore, a curved sword which doesn't have a long crossguard, you can't say, oh, well, it doesn't have the long crossguard, so that's like a minus for its edge alignment. But no, actually, because it's curved, it wouldn't need that anyway. But anyway, that's a complicated topic, but I hope I've been clear enough in explaining that. So, so just in summary, it's mostly about weight when it comes to weapon head sizes. Custard the pipe cat with a picture of a polecat, it looks like. I like your emoji or gif, actually. GIF or GIF, there's a question. I know proper hardcore geeks out there. I'm probably one of those, I admit. Will say GIF, but I like GIF. Wing083 asks, what edge, angle or degree do you typically like to sharpen rifle officers' sabres and arming swords? So 40 degrees is often quoted. I think that I probably go slightly more shallow than 40 degrees, to be honest, but it depends on the specific sword. To be honest, with antique swords, I tend not to mess with the edges too much. I only use ones that have already been service sharpened, and what I essentially do is I restore the edge. So I don't alter the edge angle, I don't really remove. I mean, obviously, when you sharpen, you are removing material, but it's not material that anyone could ever notice had been removed. And I simply polish down those planes. So when there's service sharpening on an antique, all I do is I polish the planes such that they become service sharp again at the actual edge. In terms of an arming sword, so a replica sword, if I'm sharpening it from scratch, then I tend to do an angle which is probably about, so what's that, that's 90, I don't know, maybe it is about 40 degrees. To be completely honest, I don't measure it, so I don't necessarily think about it, but maybe it is about 40 degrees. Obviously, the finer you make an edge, generally speaking, the better it will cut, but also the more fragile it'll be. So it will require more maintenance, it will get damaged more easily, and if you're actually fencing with it, obviously it will get mashed up more easily. So it's always that balance between a robust edge that is sharp or a really super sharp fine edge that will probably cut better, but is more damaged, more fragile. Right, thank you for the question. So Thomas Morris, also super chat, says, I do MMA and BJJ. Is it possible to win a HEMA tournament with grappling techniques and a submission? I've always wondered if HEMA guys shot double legs. So the answer is yes, it is. So if someone's a very good grappler, in most, obviously all HEMA, so there is not one standard set of HEMA rules. But that being said, most events, be it Swordfish or the Wessex League or Fight Camp or Long Point or any of the big events that have a tournament element to them, most of them have rules which are approximately similar. And most of them allow the same sorts of things. For example, they don't usually allow throwing of weapons. They don't usually allow full force kicks or punches. And equally with a takedown, it usually has to be done in a relatively safe and controlled manner. For safety reasons, we're not wearing... For a start, most HEMA people aren't really trained in grappling, not adequately. Secondly, we're often on a floor that is not safe to be. It's not an octagon. It's not safe to just like slam someone's head onto, because you'll give them brain damage. So the fundamental, and the equipment we're wearing can sometimes work against us. So a fencing mask, for example, a fencing mask can actually be quite injurious. If you punch someone in the front of a fencing mask, the mesh actually carries into their forehead and nose. So we have to be somewhat careful. But that being said, there are some people who are very good grapplers who do use it in HEMA tournaments, and so long as it's not done in a malicious and gratuitous way, absolutely. If you submit someone or disarm someone, kind of even better. So in a weapon-based context, disarming someone is kind of like even more martially valid than just throwing them on the floor, because technically, if you throw them on the floor and they're holding a weapon, they might still hack you in the leg or wherever, the crotch, and they might kill you. But if you can disable their sword and disarm them of their sword, that's one of the highest achievements really in European sources a lot of the time, whether it's a dagger or a sword or poleaxe or whatever. So absolutely, grappling is allowed. It's usually controlled to some extent. Very often if people get into a grapple, a lot of tournament rules will only allow a certain amount of time for that grapple to resolve itself, after which point it just gets so messy that it becomes too difficult for the judges to judge what the hell happened. So they normally go like, you grapple and then maybe you have like, I don't know, a few seconds, 5 seconds for something to happen, and if both people are still tussling at that point, they just regard it as a nothing and reset. But different tournaments are different, and not all of them will regard it like that. But to answer the question simply, yes, absolutely. If you grapple someone into submission safely, or you disarm them safely, then you'll win a point, and you might, if you can do it repeatedly, you might win a tournament just like that. The final thing I would say on it, though, is that grappling in a weapon-based martial art, it's very difficult for most people to successfully grapple and not get cut or stabbed by the opponent's weapon. Now, whilst we're using safe, blunt, and non-pointed weapons, you can be hit, and it might, it might hurt, it might not hurt, but it won't actually physically do anything to you. So if you're grappling with someone and you're just about to throw them on the ground and they clunk you on the head with the blade of their sword, you can still throw them on the ground. If that was a sharp sword, and if you weren't wearing a fencing mask and they clunk you on the head with the sharp edge of their sword, that throw might never have happened. So one of my only bugbears is when they allow grappling to conclude after a weapon hit has happened that would have completely changed the fight. Because obviously sharp edges and sharp points can disable or kill, and that wouldn't have enabled the grappling to happen the same way after that point. But anyway, really good question. Thanks for asking that, and thanks for your super chat. Let's just go. I'm sorry, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat this evening. I've got really bad hay fever at the moment, so it's making me very bunged up. Andrew Salhaney says, do you see bladed weapons coming back into common use in the future? Blades over guns in spaceship combat? Honestly, probably no. Despite the fact I would love to be able to say yes because I'm a champion of bladed weapons, the basic problem is that bladed weapons are powered by muscle and guns are powered by explosives. A muscle can just never be as powerful as an explosive can. Now, the only possible exception to that might be if hand weapons are somehow leveled up, like lightsabers, for example, to a point where their potency against maybe body armor is even more effective than a firearm projectile. So I think that's the only way it might happen. But it's a really good question, and I think armor always has to play a part. So whether it's Dune kind of force field armor or whether it's kind of Warhammer 40k big mechs type armor, I think for hand weapons to be, even in that context, for hand weapons to be sort of make a comeback and be effective, they would have to have, some type of, whether it's vibro blades like you have in Star Wars, or light plasma blades, or perhaps even explosive blades, I don't know. They would have to have something that made them more than simply muscle powered. Right. So TRSHBRNR1, which I can't say is a word, I'm afraid, on Super Chat asked, in addition to the Manx Sword of State, are you familiar with any other Manx weapons? I'm really sorry, but no, I'm not, actually, not at all. So I'm sorry that you had a wasted Super Chat, but I'm afraid I don't. But I tell you what, I'll go away and I will Google it. Hold on, I'll tell you what, I could even do that now. Hold on, let's look at Manx swords. Oh, that is interesting. So the Sword of State is a two-hander, as Sword of States often are, but there are some Viking era swords. Oh, that's very interesting. Okay, well, you've given me something else to research. So these are clearly swords with Scandinavian influence. I would say primarily not Swedish, maybe Norwegian by the look of them. Maybe even, I don't know. One of those swords looks almost like swords you find in Finland. But anyway, very interesting. Thank you for the question. I will go and research that more. So who we got? Shozbot. I'm always doing a bit of a gamble when I read these things out, because I always read the person's name before I start actually reading what they've written. So you could write anything there and I'd probably read it out before I managed to verbally edit it. So Shozbot in Super Chat has asked, Avatar: The Last Airbender. So I have to, unfortunately I've not watched it. So could Sokka's boomerang be accurately thrown, and could it do any real damage? Also, what do you think of his space sword? Right, I'm going to Google that. Right, this is lots of advertising for Google here, but I suppose they are paying me. So Sokka swords. Oh wow, okay, so it looks like a Chinese jian. It's just a Chinese jian. Is that right? It just looks exactly like a two-handed, well, kind of hand and a half Chinese jian. Yeah, I mean that looks fine, but is it constructed in some weird way? I don't know. It just looks like a jian. Let's have a look at the boomerang here. Right, boomerang. Sokka, am I saying that right? Oh right, that's pretty cool. So the boomerang doesn't look like a boomerang at all. That actually looks like certain forms of African throwing knife, as they're called, or a tomahawk, or certain types of Native American, the gunstock clubs. That looks really cool. I mean, it's like a throwing axe, isn't it? So yeah, absolutely, that looks like a completely valid. Could it be accurately thrown, and would it do any real damage? Hell yeah, it's a sharpened piece of metal. If you throw it at someone, it'll do some damage. So there we go. Toku Lover 89, thank you for your super chat. Martian Lemon says, thank you for teaching me the importance of context. You're always welcome. I have enough context to go around for everyone. So Wing 083 says, Matt, you had mentioned you did sharpen reproduction arming swords to about 40 degrees. Is that 40 degrees on each side of the blade, or 40 degrees in total, so 20 and 20 on each side? Yes, it's 20 and 20 on each side, so 40 degrees between the two planes. So if we imagine that's 90 degrees and that's 45 degrees, okay, it's a little bit less than that. Okay, so yeah, so 20 and 20 is and that, I must say, that's not something I've devised. I have to be clear. That is 40 degrees has been spoken about by people like Peter Johnson and the people at Albion, obviously, who he works with. Loads of people have talked about this 40 degrees. It's a compromise angle. It's not the finest edge, but it is a robust edge, and it's what a lot of people seem to use as a benchmark. I would just add, antique swords do not adhere to any such regularity. Antique swords that have been sharpened can sometimes be super fine, like a kitchen knife, or sometimes really robust, probably like 45, 50 degrees edge. So they vary hugely. It depends what type of sword, what period, and even just individually even within the same period in the same area, even just individual swords. Luna Corvidae, thank you for your super chat. Jem Dillon, where can I read about the day-to-day culture and practices of Renaissance fencing schools in Europe and England? England's still part of Europe, geographically. Seems to be a dearth of such info out there. Love your work, being a fan, thank you. So, where can you find out more about the day-to-day culture and practices of Renaissance fencing schools? I would say probably your best bet is to look at some of the treatises, actually. So there are some really good books written by people like Rob Runacres about particularly 16th, 17th century fencing schools, for which we have the most written material remaining, both in terms of treatises and in terms of things written about the actual fencing masters and their schools and everything else. So I would have a look at, there's a good book by Aylward called The English Master of Defence. I would have a look at Rob Runacres' works. Have a look on the Harrour website, so Hroarr. Have a look on Harrour. So there's some really good essays, articles, written on there, and links to more books. So that's the HEMA Resources website. So have a look on there and you'll probably turn up lots of good stuff. In terms of the primary source material, obviously a lot of it's not written in English, it's written in Italian and German and Spanish and so on. But you'll get lots of good links from the Harrour website. I hope that's helpful. Luna says, I forgot to post my question in my first super chat. Oh, I'm sorry about that. But I don't mind to give it to you. Thank you. Here's my question. What is the average weight of a crossguard and pommel of Middle Ages? Oh, that's a good question. Do you know, I've never weighed a crossguard and a pommel individually, but I know that blades, so a medieval arming sword, if it weighs about 1,100 grams, let's say, 1,200 grams, lots of arming swords weigh, the blade will usually be about 700 or 800 grams of that, I think. So you're probably looking at the combined crossguard, grip and pommel being about 500 grams, I'm guessing. So usually if you've got a sword, say, of 1,200 grams, probably about 500 grams, 500 grams of that will be the hilt, whereas about 800 grams, 800 grams will be the blade. that's, I think, an average kind of approximation of the split between the two things. So the blade is usually the heaviest element, but it's usually about 60% of the total weight, 60-70% of the total weight. Obviously, that varies with different types of swords. More complex hilts, the percentage of total mass is increased with a complex hilt, of course, because there's a complex hilt there. Right. There is a super chat that I can't see there. Right, I'm just going to have a look at the other questions that are outside of the super chat for a minute. So Knight's House Games says, can I do a video about cookery sharpening? Yeah, I can. I can and I will. I've got several cookeries that I do sharpen regularly because I use them for stuff. And I have to say, cookeries, I was talking about edge angles, bevel angles. Cookeries do usually have, at least on old antiques, maybe not on the modern ones, but on old antiques, tend to have a smaller edge angle than 40 degrees. They're probably more like 30 degrees to guess. Incidentally, I just want to say I believe we've got about 500 people currently watching the live stream, so thank you very, very much for joining us. It's great to have you all here. Just slightly off topic for a minute. It's been really weird times, I think, for YouTubers during the lockdown, because obviously when you're a YouTuber, you look at the analytics and you look at the things that are popular and you try to do more of that, and you try to learn how to, develop your channel, grow your channel, what you need to do more of, what you maybe need to do less of, what you need to change. And the lockdown has been so weird. Certainly for my channel, I don't know if it's been the same for everyone's, but if this is the normal analytics during lockdown, everything else has just been doing weird stuff. Advertisers all went completely mental in one direction when lockdown started and pulled lots of funding away from advertising, which obviously hit people like YouTube. But then lots of other companies are wanting to now directly advertise through YouTubers, and the viewing initially went down bizarrely. Then it went really up, and then it seems to have gone down again, I think because people are going back to work in a lot of countries. And so, yes, weird stuff that's going on. As a YouTuber, whilst we can't complain because we can keep doing our job at home just like we always do, lockdown's been a very weird time. Hold on. So Wing083 says Sokka's sword is made from a meteorite, hence it's called a space sword. Also, would you want a saber made from a meteorite? It depends what the meteorite's made of, doesn't it? So meteoric iron was used in weapons. So for anyone who doesn't know, if you go to Southeast Asia, for example, you can find meteoric iron used in certain blades, I believe. So in the early days of the use of iron for knives and anything else, before iron was being mined, the only source of iron was meteoric iron that was found pretty much on the surface of the land. So yes, absolutely, you can refine. It's iron is iron. The element is the same, but there will be lots of weird stuff mixed in with it. Sometimes good things like nickel, sometimes bad things. So yeah, if you can work the iron, and if you can get the things that you don't want in it out, and then you can get a bit of carbon into it, which is relatively easy. You can turn it into low carbon steel, or maybe even proper good steel. So yeah, absolutely, you can use iron from a meteorite, 100%. And I think I've never looked into this, and maybe I need to. I think there was an iron knife in King Tutankhamun's tomb that is believed to be meteoric iron, and it's believed to be meteoric from the elements that it has mixed with the iron in it. So right, let's have a look at some other questions. So Ryan Smith says, have you ever used a Czech farmer's flail? No, I haven't. I don't know anything about it. Tell me more. Simon Grushka says, in the episode about teaching the fighting to the Tudor kings, you've mentioned the English wrestling. Would you mind to elaborate more about it? Provide title. Unfortunately, I don't know an awful lot more because it's not something that I've researched, but it's something that I know people who have researched it and have. So I've received secondhand information, basically. So I believe that in Germany under Emperor Maximilian II, I think it was, he had an English wrestling master, and there was a technique or a throw that is mentioned in a German source, a particular wrestling move that is described as the English throw. And so I understand in a bunch of German sources of the 16th century, maybe late 15th, early 16th century, English wrestling is referred to in various ways. And I have to say, going to later periods, there were wrestling styles, just like the Swiss have Schwingen, and there's like Icelandic wrestling and other wrestling traditions that survived. Britain in the 19th century still had surviving wrestling styles like Westmoreland and Cumberland wrestling and Lancashire wrestling and all these others. And Lancashire wrestling, I think, morphed into catch wrestling. So there was a very strong wrestling tradition in England, and we know this goes back at least to the 13th century. Because there's laws about wrestling competitions. So at the same time that they brought in laws in English cities saying that you couldn't hold a fencing school in an English city, in other words, you had to go out of the city to learn fencing because they didn't want troublemakers waving swords around in the city. You couldn't do archery practice within the city. I think you couldn't hang people within the city, and you couldn't have jousting tournaments within the city. You also, if you wanted to have a wrestling tournament, had to have it outside the city walls. And so that's interesting because that tells us that those things were happening. So there you go. There's some stuff. I hope that's roughly interesting. Justin Cook, why do you think crossbows don't get a lot of attention in fantasy films, even though they're so cool and historical for lots of different time periods? Mechanical reasons. I think it's difficult for prop makers and people in movies to make crossbows that function well on screen in terms of loading and shooting. And also they've got a slow rate of fire. So cinematographic, is that a word? Terms, they're not, I don't think they're very exciting. Like it'd be like, imagine, like Todd's videos are great, but you've seen him loading a windlass crossbow, yeah? Even the hand-spanned crossbows, which are quite weak, frankly. They don't have very long range. But, if you've got windlass, can you imagine? Bang! Oh, I shot an orc. Load, hold the bolt in the mouth, but kind of 20 seconds later, boom! I shot another orc. They just don't work well on screen, I guess. But also the physical objects, I think, are difficult. But they have been, they've used crossbows in Game of Thrones. They've used it in a few movies. Certainly, the things like Chinese repeating crossbows could work quite well on screen, I think. But I think a lot of things in movies are, whether it's to do with swords or bows or crossbows or anything else, it's to do with convention. And movie makers, I think people by inclination are quite conservative and stick in the mud. And I think movie makers are no different. They know, hey, that movie did well. Let's just kind of copy what they did and make money like they did. That's because, unfortunately, for most movie producers, that's what it's about at the end of the day, isn't it? It's just a product. They're just there to sell a product. So if they can just replicate something that someone else has done, even in some case using the same props, using the same armor and weapons, then they'll do it. And you look, as soon as you have a successful series like Game of Thrones or Vikings or whatever, all the imitators come out the woodwork. And that's why we get these things that move in batches. One superhero movie is successful, you have 10 more superhero movies come out. One Roman era movie comes out, suddenly you have a clutch more of kind of sword and sandals epics coming out in its wake, and they just copy what went before. And if that successful movie used leather armor or used Conan looking fantasy swords, then the next movie that's like it will just copy that thing, won't they? So Lexion 21 says meteorite have iron in them and is likely slightly irradiated. Yeah, I mean, it's, all meteorites are different. So you can have meteorite. How did we get on to talking about meteorites? But this is awesome. So So I live right near somewhere that is thought to be the result of a meteorite's impact in, obviously, a very, very long time ago. Meteorites can be made of anything, not anything, but lots of things. And yes, some of them are iron, some of them are water. So lots of meteorites never make it to Earth because they're made of ice, and they literally burn up, melt in the atmosphere on the way through. Or they can be made of other types of mineral and stuff that don't ever make it to land. But yeah, iron meteorites definitely something that were used in early prehistoric weapon making, or prehistoric and early historic weapon making. So Gilgamesh Ethics says, curious if you've seen The Last Kingdom, and if so, what did you think about the weapons in it? Particularly, I liked the amber pommel and the fact that they used shield walls. So I have done a movie about The Last Kingdom and that amber pommel, as it happens, a long time ago now. I actually made that video before the TV series came out, and I felt a bit sorry for the series because I slated it so badly. And actually, so a season, as my understanding of The Last Kingdom is, the first season, I'm not fully up to date, I haven't seen the latest season, but the first season I believe was shown on BBC, and it was quite boring, which is a shame because the books it's based on I'd read and they're good, Bernard Cornwell. But when Netflix took it over, is it Netflix? Yeah, it is Netflix. When Netflix took it over, I think they made it really good. So I really, really enjoyed, is it second and third? Are we on the fourth season now? Anyway, I really enjoyed what Netflix did with it, and I really, really like it. What do I think about the weapons? I think overall, the weapons are better historically than Vikings, for example, the TV series. Now, I do really like Vikings. I love Vikings TV series, but some of the arms and armour in it is awful. Like the Wessex soldiers wearing burgonets from the 16th century, and this idea that, Vikings use round shields, so we have to have the other people they fight use shields of a different shape. No, everybody used that type of shield. The Franks, the Anglo-Saxons, it doesn't matter whether they're from Northumbria or Wessex. Not like everyone had different shields. And again, I understand why the movie makers or TV show makers do it, because they want the audience to be able to easily tell who is who. I understand that, but I can still moan about it, okay? I can still bitch about it. Leave me that. But to answer the question, in brief terms, I think the weapons and the armour, they leave a lot to be desired. But, I'm not so much of a pedant. I can't just watch a TV show and enjoy it. And I do actually really like The Last Kingdom. I think it's quite cool. And I like the fact that it's not hugely popular. I'm an indie kid at soul, and I like things that are slightly less popular. But no, I like it. So Kirin Ranchu says, have you ever held a Danish longsword or Scandinavian greatsword before? So yes, I have. I've held the Albion Danish longsword. A friend of mine had it years ago, and it's weird. It's weird having such a long grip, or it was weird to me at the time, having such a long hilt or grip relative to the blade length, or just in general, just such a massive grip. But since then, I now have two of the two-handed LK Chen GNs, the big two-handed GN, and they're kind of similar to that, except the GN are lighter. They're very, very interesting swords, those Scandinavian greatswords. I don't know if we really should call them greatswords, because the blades aren't that long. It's just they've got very long hilts on them. Now, what's interesting, which I don't think a lot of people know, is there is a characteristic style of English longsword or big longsword or greatsword that you find from about the middle of the 15th century right the way through to certainly the early part of the 16th century. So Henry VIII's armour in the Royal Armouries, for example, is famously equipped with one. And they also have very long hilts. And I do think that that's culturally interesting, because historically England, of course, has quite long-lasting connections with Scandinavia. Geographically, of course, we're only separated from Norway by a stretch of water in the north and by Denmark in the south. Also, ethnically and kind of culturally, our languages are very closely related, and obviously the whole Anglo-Saxon and Viking area, we had a strong connection with Scandinavia. But what a lot of people don't know is that even in the later medieval period, in trade terms, there were still very close connections between Scandinavia and England. People always focus on England's connections with France in terms of war, or even Spain as well to some degree, especially once we get into the sort of age of piracy and colonialism and stuff like this, and Portugal historically, of course, as well, for similar reasons. But what people don't necessarily know is that there were always strong trading and particularly fishing connections with Scandinavia. Now, whether there's any connection between the English greatswords and the Scandinavian greatswords, I don't know. But I do find it interesting that both these geographic areas in the north of Europe have very long gripped longswords or greatswords. So anyway, really interesting question. Thanks, Kirin. They are lovely looking things. I've got to say, personally, I find the hilts too long for me, but I'm just not used to them. And I also find the crossguards a bit short for their overall size. I like a longer crossguard, which ironically, well not ironically, kind of poetically I suppose, the English greatswords have ridiculously long crossguards on them. So that's completely different to the Scandinavian ones, but there we go. Jorg Gracha says, besides the German and English manuscripts and treatises, what other manuals have I explored, and what other manuals would you like to explore? So I would actually genuinely like to, so there's a whole bunch of things are coming to my head. If I had unlimited time, if I was immortal, so I would love to, in theory, learn a bit of Spanish destreza. I would love to learn some German saber, 19th century saber, because the German 19th century saber is very different to the British sort of Anglo-French saber, and it's inspired. It's influenced by the Schlager, by the Mädchenfechten kind of method, I think. I would really like to learn more about some of the Spanish and South American saber sources, some of which are destreza. So like rapier destreza influenced but applied to the military saber. Very interesting. And then stepping into other periods and other places, I would love if the surviving Indian treatises were available and translated, looking at the use of Indian weapons in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now those treatises are under lock and key in Indian archives, but I know they exist because I've seen single pictures from them, and I've seen that there are catalogue references to them, but they're not in those places anymore. So they're very difficult to access. They might even be lost, but I think they exist. So I'd love to see Indian treatises translated and studied. I would love to see more of the Persian and North African, the Mamluk stuff and the Iranian Persian stuff, and Turkish as well. There's some very interesting archery treatises, actually, very interesting early 14th century, I think, 14th, 15th century Turkish archery treatises. So I'd like to learn more about that stuff. And also, I've got more and more interested in the Chinese stuff, I have to say. As you know, I mentioned earlier, I used to study Kung Fu. China's fascinating history, and I really like Chinese weapons aesthetically. They speak to me. So I would love to know, so for anyone who doesn't know, go to the Chinese Longsword website, which has been around for a decade or more, and every now and again they add another manual or treatise to it covers a wide period. They've got everything, I think, maybe about 15th, 16th century earlier stuff, all the way up to 20th century World War II period stuff. So it's essentially like HEMA, but with Chinese sources. Awesome, fascinating stuff. I'd love to learn more about that stuff. So yeah, that probably answers that question pretty completely, I would think. Thank you for your question. So Ryan Smith again says, what's your absolute favourite film sword fight? I don't know. I don't know. I'd have to come back to that one. That's too big of a question. I think I could do a whole video with probably 20 sword fights that I like for different reasons. Not necessarily because they're good, technically, but just because I really love that movie, or I love what how the fight is part of the story, or how it shows the characters. I don't know. It's a very complex question, that one. I'll have to come back to that. Right, let's have a look through here. So Colt 818 says, have I seen the 5,000-year-old... Oops. Have I seen the 5,000-year-old metal knife discovered in Anatolia? I think I have. Is it a short sword? If it's a short sword, I think I have. And it's actually on my to-do list for researching to do a video in the future. If it's something else, I don't know. Right. John Smith. This is kind of a private question, but I'll answer it anyway. Did I buy the Wilkinson pattern book? No, I didn't, unfortunately. Brigadier 998 says Potop, which is, I think, The Deluge. The Polish film is awesome. Yeah, I still haven't seen it. People keep asking me to review that, and I know other people have reviewed it anyway. I think Scalagrim has. I can't remember if Raffaello did, but yeah, I'll watch it at some point. So, Vicious CB, you have literally read my mind. Are you going to do a video on the swords and guns of the show Sharp? Yes. In fact, I was going to be doing a related video today, but we've had workmen working on our roof at the house, and they were hammering and sawing all day, and I couldn't film the video. I had to stop trying to film because there was too much noise interference. So there is a Richard Sharp, Bernard Cornwell books. There is a related video coming very, very soon. I'm going to be looking at the 1796 heavy cavalry, so I'm going to do a couple of videos with that. Right, let's just have a look over at the super chats. Mark Suarez in super chat has said Vikings and Into the Badlands as examples. Thoughts on upbringing in martial societies, realistic modern possibilities versus fictional depictions. Yes, that's an interesting point, Mark. I'm not sure what to say in reply. I think a lot of the kind of warrior society or martial, I'm reluctant to say this, martial race mindset is a Victorian hangover. And I think we've got to be really careful about not falling into the same old cliches from 19th century literature that has been repeated again and again and again. For example, Viking society, we actually don't really know very much about. And we have a very, I think, a very modern vision of what Vikings are. And there's been a reaction to that in archaeology. So you all know I'm an archaeologist by background. And a big chunk of the archaeological community kind of reacted to the stereotype of Vikings, but I think it went too far in the opposite direction and tried to make them all out as peaceful traders. The fact is that we have some black and white history that we know categorical things happened. We know that, from 793 onwards, the Vikings were a problem, a raiding problem, in quite a lot of northwestern Europe and in some cases southern Europe as well. But equally, we know they also settled, and they sometimes settled peacefully. So there's some very complicated mechanisms going on there, and I think that we would be unwise to think of the Vikings as being drastically different to Franks and Anglo-Saxons and Longobards of their time. I think we've almost got to try and get into the mindset of that time and region before we then go, well, how were the Vikings different to that? And fundamentally, I think at that time and place, a lot of it came down to religion and and how that connected to law as well. And so I think a lot of friction between certain warrior societies and whoever we're calling not warrior societies, because let's face it, every society had warriors, otherwise they wouldn't have lasted for very long. I think it often comes down to one group's interpretation of law and honour and religion and, in some cases, the consequences of their actions, the differences between those two cultures. And sometimes that created a clash. But it's a very complicated question. I hope that's a little bit interesting. So Wing083 has asked another question on Super Chat. How do you figure out what angle a sword reproduction or antique was originally sharpened to, so you can resharpen it based on the original edge angles, so you don't accidentally mess with the geometry? But you can see the edge bevels. If something was service sharpened, basically here's your blade. So you've got, say it's a saber, you've got essentially, if you cut through it and looked from the top, you'd have a triangle. You've got the back of the blade, you've got the flats of the blade, and then you've got the edge. And usually the edge comes not quite to an edge, and then you have a secondary bevel. Okay, and sometimes that secondary bevel, instead of it being straight and then straight again, sometimes it's smoothed off into an appleseed edge. But that's fundamentally, you've still got two angles. You've got the angle that the final edge meets at, and then you've got the angles of the flat. And you just look for that angle that the final bevel, the final edge bevel met at, and you just polish that, basically. But with antiques, not all of them were service sharpened. So if you're applying service sharpening for the first time, just go for 40 degrees or use your judgment. But looking at originals is always the best. The more originals you can look at, the more likely you are to be able to restore things well and replicate things well as well. And I did a video about this recently, pointing out that if you want to replicate swords well, you've got to study the original swords. You can't replicate something if you don't know what you're replicating. So you have to study the originals before you can make convincing or good quality replicas. Right, I'm going to have to sign off in about 5 minutes because I need to get some sleep tonight. But we've had pretty much consistently 500 people online for most of this, which is absolutely awesome. I don't think I've missed any of the super chats. I've got one super chat from Shozbot at the bottom, which isn't showing up in my super chat window. So I will try to see if I can find that in the other chat window over here. There's some really stuff talking about Shozbot's skull here. Oh, here, I found it. Shozbot says, in Goodfellas, Joe Pesci stabs Maury in the back of the head, base of the skull, with a very skinny one-handed thrusting weapon. Was it historical? I don't know. I can't remember. I've seen Goodfellas. It's a great film, but I can't remember what he's. Was it as a stiletto, or was the stab historical? So my view of this is going to get a bit graphic and a little bit morbid now. So my view of bone and its resistance of things completely changed when I chopped up a dead pig that had been freshly slaughtered. So I was doing it for the show Ancient Assassins, that classy show, but they were actually brilliant to work with and really fun. And I was doing it for the Attila the Hun episode, and they procured me a freshly killed pig from an abattoir that was literally picked up that morning from the abattoir and driven straight to where we were filming, and I got to chop it up with a couple of different swords. I used a Viking era sword for the Alfred the Great episode, and I used a replica Hunnish saber for the Attila the Hun episode. And I was very surprised by how soft living or freshly killed bone is. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the skull, whether you're talking about the limbs or the ribs or whatever. Now, obviously, different bones have different densities and different sizes. So ribs are kind of honeycomb or hollow inside. I've studied skeletons quite a lot as an archaeologist. I've dug dead people out of the ground, so I'm very familiar with skeletons. But a pig skeleton is, some parts of its body are similar to a human and some parts are very different, and the skull is very different because it's got a much bigger skull and much bonier, much stronger than a human skull. So, coming back to Goodfellas, I now think, based on that experience, that it wouldn't be that difficult to stab something through a human skull. I have handled human skulls lots of times archaeologically, and they're not very thick. Now, while a skull can be, relatively speaking, hard-headed, I've got quite a hard head, luckily, compared to lots of animals, we've got pretty thin skulls, and certainly at the back, you don't have very much at all. So was it historical? I don't even know if this is the question, really, that Shosbot's asking, actually, but if you're asking, is it historical to stab someone in the base of the skull? Yes. Can it be done with a sharp object? Yes. And was the skinny one-handed thrusting weapon historical? I don't know because I don't remember it, but it sounds like a stiletto, so yes. I hope that I hope that's interesting. Ryan Smith says, I live in Prague. All I can say is, you lucky bastard. Prague looks absolutely gorgeous place to live, and everything I hear about the Czech Republic makes me think that it is a fantastic country to live in. And if I was free without commitments in the UK and family and everything else, that's somewhere I'd definitely consider moving to. It seems like you can own lots of different types of guns in the Czech Republic as well, which I'd be a big fan of. If there's one thing I hate about the UK, it's our firearms laws. But what you going to do? I can't help the fact that I was born British. Right, so 667 Gullin says Vikings equals medieval motorcycle gangs. Pretty much, yeah. If you believe the movies, that's it. Zaku the second, or Zaku 2, says, Matt, can you do a video on weapons designed for untrained peasants like the Hussite flail that make use of mechanical motions that peasants are familiar with and judge their effectiveness? Yeah, that's a pretty cool. I was actually going to do a video on agricultural bills, and I can't remember why, but I never got around to doing it. That's a cool. I'd really like one of those flails, actually. I've always meant to kind of get around to making one at some point, because you totally could. I think anybody could make one of those Hussite flails, but yeah, why not? Why not make a massive flail? Maybe I should have a go at that. Maybe that should be my next project. Right. I like how Brigadier is advising Shosbot how to find the weak spot at the base of his skull. That's gold right there. Yes, Richard Sharp video. Good, Chip. I'll get on it. I'll get on that. Right, okay. So let's see what I've missed on the... Oh, Kristamir Rakov, I missed your super chat. Did I? Let's have a look up. I hate to miss a super chat. I swear it's not appearing. Your message saying, sorry, I did miss it. I totally missed it. What's the biggest... Oh, right, okay. Oh, it seems I missed a few super chats, so I apologise for that. Right, so let's quickly go through these super chats while I've still got a few minutes left. So, Chip Ford says, hi Matt, thanks for answering my first question. Some of my modern kukris have quite thick blades, nearly ½ an inch at the base. They handle more like hatchets. Do historical kukris have thinner blades? Yes, they have more distal taper. So my general observation is that modern kukris tend to be overweight. So that's not to say that historical ones are necessarily thin at the base of the blade, but they taper and their fullers remove weight. So the modern ones tend to be a little bit overweight. Yes, 100%. I've never personally, I know that you can get some really good ones out there, but I've never personally seen a modern replica or modern kukri that handles as nicely as the antiques. And the antiques are quite affordable, so I do recommend you have a look on auction websites and stuff, or dealers' websites, and pick yourself one up, and then you can compare for yourself. Kristamir Rakov says, what's the biggest number of swords a human character can realistically wear on himself, on his belt and back? Back wearing, that's for Shad, that's not for me. No, okay. We'll allow some back wearing at any point in time while travelling around on foot to fight enemies, monsters, etc. Asking for a role-playing game campaign. Perfectly valid question. I would say if you wanted to be ludicrous, you could wear 2 on your left, 2 on your right, and 2 on your back. And I think that is the maximum physically that you could wear, but it would be ridiculous. So I would say that 6 is probably the most swords you could wear, but it would be quite impractical. Although you could physically do it, it would be quite impractical. And I would say realistically, 2 swords for most people who are going to have to carry other things and do other things, get on and off horses, climb over things, run, all that kind of stuff. 2 swords, really. 1 on each side, 2 on one side, or 1 on the side and 1 on the back. So 2 swords is practical. 1 sword's even more practical. 2 swords is practical. 6 swords is maximum but ludicrous. I hope that helps. So Mad Cow Disease says, thank you for all your content. Oh, thank you. So my channel is your favourite on YouTube. That is very nice to hear. I feel like my channel's been around for a long time and just grows really, really slowly compared to everyone else's. I realise I talk too much and I repeat myself too much and I don't do as good editing as other people. It is what it is. But I'm glad that some of you like it, and please keep watching. Senators Populusque Romanus says, deathmatch between Carthage and the Eternal City, who would win? I like the idea of Carthage because of like elephants and stuff. I found out something really fascinating from Lloyd Lindybage himself, who I know personally to some degree, and apparently Carthaginian elephants, if I remember correctly, and if I understood correctly, Carthaginian elephants are an extinct type of elephant. And they're more similar to Indian elephants than African elephants, which when you think about it, and the fact that people are riding on, makes a lot of sense. And African elephants are essentially sub-Saharan African elephants, and the type of elephants you got in North Africa were more like Persian and Asian elephants. Very interesting. But thank you for your super chat. And right, so I'm back on track with the super chats. Oh, Martin Walgren. Hey dude, how you doing? Old man Shredder. I know to look out for you now. Thanks for the super chat, Martin, and thanks for keeping watching. I haven't chatted to you for years, but I hope you're doing well, and I hope the archery's going... Are you still doing archery? I hope so. Yeah, good to hear from you, man. Hope things are good over there in Sweden. Right, I'm going to have to sign off now, but this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining. I think I've got one more super chat to address. Yeah, I've got one more super chat here from New Crofter. Are there any specific treatises for hangers? Hangers being short sabres from the 18th, 19th century. Technically from the 15th century onwards as well, but most people when they say hangers are talking about 18th, 19th century. Possibly 17th. What would you recommend for someone wanting to train them that may be different than sabre? Dussac. I strongly recommend Dussac to people. So look at the Dussac treatises. So then, if you've got for Dussac, you've got 16th and 17th century sources, things like Joachim Meyerb, you've got Suter, bunch of Polysector, a bunch of others. So look at the Dussac treatises. And Dussac's really freaking cool. And what's cool about Dussac is you can use a sabre with Dussac treatises. You can use a pirate cutlass you can use a 17th century or 18th century cutlass or hanger with a Dussac method, technique, system. But equally, Dussac really is the ancestor of later sabre methods. So those two things can go together as well. So if you do Dussac and you do maybe some sabre or some naval cutlass, then those two things can kind of merge together at some point. You can sort of cross-pollinate a bit. Finally, I would say, are there any specific treatises for hangers? The only one that I know for certain that shows hangers is Miller, and you can find Miller on the Linacre School of Defence website. That's Milo Thurston's website. So the Linacre, as in Linacre College, Oxford, Linacre School of Defence website, and they've got Miller on there. But I will warn you, it shows what it calls, I think it calls them falchions in there, but they're actually hangers because the word falchion at that point was used interchangeably. Whilst it shows them being used, it doesn't really tell you anything about their use. It just shows some pictures of them being used. But from the pictures, you can infer that they were used very similarly to almost halfway between, I suppose, a backsword and a sabre, but not dissimilarly in some ways to a dussac, but with a stance and lunge and recover footwork probably, but with a stance, more upright stance, as found in 18th century treatises. So what really changes is the system of footwork and the way that the body is held. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, you tend to have more passing footwork still, although that becomes more lunge and recover footwork as you go through into the 17th, later in the 17th century, with small sword influence and rapier influence. And you're usually with the knees bent and lower down, and as we get into the 18th century, certainly in Britain, people are more standing upright and using smaller footwork, which is great for lazy people, I have to say. So there we go. I hope that's given you something to go on. Was that the last super chat? I think there's another super chat coming. I will get through these super chats before I sign off, I promise. Oh, Lee. Lee says greetings. Thanks for the live chat. Thanks, Lee. Thanks for coming on again. Great to see you. I hope you're doing well. So, interesting. Jordan Smith says Middle Eastern lions were also hunted to extinction. So funnily, by pure coincidence, I was at London Zoo yesterday, and they have Asiatic lions at London Zoo, which are obviously the type of lions from Gujarat in India, but they are, I believe, basically the same type of lions that used to be in Afghanistan and Persia, and I believe Turkey and Greece as well. So, ancient Greek sources that talk about lions, I believe it's basically like an Asiatic lion or very close relative to it, rather than an African lion. So Fighter says, North African elephants are extinct, likely due to overuse in warfare and hunting. Brilliant. There was some fascinating, there's some great stuff on this chat. Thank you so much for joining. It's been absolutely wonderful having you here again. And I hope I didn't miss any of your super chats. Thank you very much for those of you who put a super chat in. Much appreciated. And thank you for everyone else on the main chat. How's Cat Easton? Cat Easton's doing well. He's been particularly affectionate recently for some reason. And thank you all for joining. I will see you really soon on the channel. Lots of videos planned as always. And I'll do another super chat as soon as I'll do another live stream chat as soon as I can. And it's been great seeing you. Take care, folks, and be excellent to each other. That's the main message, I think. Take care, everyone. Good night, and I will see you soon.